On Christmas Eve, a tired Latina waitress named Marisol Vega unlocked her diner's door for a freezing stranger, never knowing he was a billionaire whose world would soon arrive to punish her for having a heart. The small roadside diner buzzed with the last clinks of cups and tired laughter, while cold rain wrapped the windows in a blurry, sorrowful glow. Marisol thought it would be just another closing shift until she watched two late customers sneer at the man outside as if his misery were entertainment. He stood there soaked to the bone, shoulders hunched like he was trying to disappear into the storm, and the wind kept pushing him as if it wanted him to fall. What Marisol did next wasn't about money. It was about dignity, and she had no idea this simple choice would turn her quiet life upside down. She stepped between the customers and the glass, not raising her voice, yet somehow making the room feel smaller for anyone who wanted to be cruel. The men laughed and tossed a few words about beggars and trouble, but Marisol held their gaze the way her mother had taught her, calm, steady, unmovable. When they finally left, the bell above the door chimed with a hollow cheer, and silence settled like dust on the booths. Marisol turned the lock, then turned it back, because the image of that man shaking in the rain wouldn't let her breathe. She opened the door just wide enough to let warmth spill out, and she watched his eyes widen as if he didn't believe warmth was still allowed in the world. He didn't ask for a handout, and that was what struck her first, because desperation usually comes with a kind of loudness, and he carried his like a sealed envelope. "Just somewhere to sit," he murmured, voice raw, as if every word cost him more than it should. Marisol guided him to the stool nearest the heater and brought a towel and a cup of coffee, letting the steam do some of the talking she didn't know how to say. His hands hovered around the mug, hesitant, and when he finally wrapped his fingers around it, he closed his eyes as if the heat hurt in a way that memories do. Marisol noticed the restraint in him, how he kept his back straight even while shivering, like a man who had been taught that collapsing was a kind of failure. She told herself she was only being practical, that she could call a shelter, that she could wait until the rain softened, that she could keep this moment contained. Yet something in her resisted turning him into a problem to be passed along, because she remembered winters when the world looked through her instead of at her. The diner was dressed for Christmas, in cheap garlands and warm lights, and for a second it felt like the room was trying to remind them both that mercy still existed. He stared at the decorations with a distant ache, the way people stare at a life they once had and can't reach anymore. When she asked his name, he paused too long, then offered one as if he were borrowing it, and Marisol heard the quiet lie without judging him for it. She let the lie stand, because she understood that sometimes people protect what little they have left by keeping their truth hidden. As he shifted closer to the heater, his sleeve rode up, and Marisol's eyes caught on a pale ring pressed into his skin, the unmistakable imprint of something heavy that had been worn for a long time. It wasn't the mark of a cheap watch, and it wasn't the kind of detail a man with nothing usually carries beneath torn fabric and street grime. The stranger noticed her glance and pulled the cuff down with a small, controlled motion, as if he were closing a door she wasn't meant to open. In that instant, the diner's warmth felt less like shelter and more like the calm before a storm she couldn't see yet. Marisol kept her face gentle and her voice kind, but deep inside a careful warning took root and refused to leave. Inside the diner, warmth didn't solve anything right away. It only made the stranger's suffering easier to see, the way light reveals cracks in old paint. Marisol kept moving as if motion itself could hold the moment together, laying a blanket over his shoulders and wringing water from his coat with quiet hands. The neon sign outside buzzed like a tired insect, and the puddle beneath his boots grew slowly, drop by patient drop, as though the night refused to let go of him. He stared at the coffee, as if it might vanish, And when he finally drank, his throat worked with a careful effort that made Marisol's chest tighten. She told herself she was in control, yet the silence carried its own pressure, asking questions she wasn't ready to answer. She tried to sound ordinary, the way waitresses learn to sound when life is messy and customers still want their pie, but her eyes kept returning to his face. Beneath the wet hair and the exhaustion, there was a restraint that didn't match the story he wore on his skin, and it made her uneasy in a way she couldn't name. When a truck passed outside and its headlights swept across the booths, he jerked as if the light had teeth, then forced himself still with a discipline that looked practiced. Marisol pretended not to notice, but she felt a mother's instinct rise in her, not only for Sophia at home, but for the fragile line between safety and danger in this room. She had seen hunger before, she had seen loneliness, yet she had rarely seen fear that looked so controlled. The clock above the counter ticked louder than it should have, and the diner's holiday decorations suddenly felt like props in a play that had gone off script. Marisol kept her voice gentle, asking small questions: where he was headed, whether he had family, whether he needed a doctor, trying to build a bridge out of simple words. He answered carefully, as if every sentence was a test he might fail, and he avoided certain details, the way people avoid stepping on broken glass. When she offered to call someone, he shook his head too fast, and the movement betrayed more panic than he meant to show. Marisol's compassion didn't disappear, but it became sharper because compassion without wisdom can be its own kind of danger. At one point he tried to stand, perhaps from pride, perhaps from shame, and his knees wobbled enough that Marisol reached out before she could think. Her fingers closed around his forearm, and she felt the hard cord of tension beneath the skin, like a man bracing for impact even while being helped. He looked at her hand as though it surprised him. Then he murmured a quiet apology that sounded older than the night itself. Marisol told him he didn't owe her apologies for being cold, and she meant it. Yet she also wondered what kind of life teaches someone to apologize for needing warmth. The moral of the moment felt simple. People are not problems to be managed, but living that truth, she realized, could cost more than she could afford. When she asked his name again, he hesitated just long enough for the lie to form, and then he gave her one, in a voice that didn't quite belong to it. Marisol nodded anyway, because she recognized the instinct to hide the self when the world has punished honesty, and she decided that shelter could come before explanations for one night. Still, the way he watched the door, listening, waiting, made her feel as if they were not alone, even with the diner empty. Outside, the rain eased into a thin, cold whisper, but the air in the room grew heavier, as though something unseen had drawn closer. Marisol rinsed a bowl in the sink and told herself she was only doing what was right, while a quieter thought pressed in behind her ribs. A man doesn't guard his name like that unless he's learned that truth can get you found. Marisol had always believed that a person's life was built from small choices made when no one was watching, and that belief had carried her through years that tried to grind her down. She remembered arriving in this town with 2 suitcases, a borrowed phone, and a baby who slept in her arms like a promise she couldn't afford to break. Most days were a simple rhythm of coffee refills, polite smiles, aching feet, and the quiet math of rent, groceries, and one small gift under a second-hand Christmas tree. She didn't call it courage, because courage sounded grand and her life felt ordinary, but she had learned how to keep moving even when pride was the only coat she owned. That night, with the rain still whispering outside the diner, she felt the old lesson return. If you can help without losing yourself, you should. When she locked the diner doors for good, the stranger stood slowly, as if his body had to negotiate with the cold still trapped in his bones. Marisol offered to call a shelter again, but he shook his head with a quiet urgency that made her skin tighten, and she realized the fear in him wasn't only about weather. The town shelters were overcrowded on holidays. and she knew what it meant to be turned away when you were already at your lowest, told politely to try again tomorrow. She stared at her car keys, then at the man's soaked shoes, and she imagined him walking back into the night like a shadow that no one would miss. In that moment, the choice formed inside her with the steady clarity of a vow. One night, one couch, one chance to stay alive until morning. The drive home was short, but it felt long because the silence in the car carried too much weight, and Marisol could hear every breath he tried to keep quiet. Streetlights slid across his face in brief flashes, revealing bruised exhaustion and a kind of sadness that looked expensive, like it had been paid for with years rather than hours. He thanked her once, softly, and the words sounded unfamiliar in his mouth, as if gratitude was a language he'd stopped speaking. Marisol kept her eyes on the road, telling herself she was not foolish, only human, and that decency was not a weakness unless you let someone turn it into one. Yet as they turned onto her street, she saw a parked car she didn't recognize, and a faint worry stirred, like an ember refusing to go out. Her apartment building smelled of laundry soap and old carpets, and the stairwell lights flickered like they were tired of pretending everything was fine. Marisol nudged her door open carefully, expecting Sophia to be asleep on the couch with a blanket and the cartoon channel still playing low. Instead, Sophia stood in the hallway in socks, hair messy, clutching a small ornament she had made from cardboard and glitter, her eyes wide with that childlike seriousness that always made Marisol soften. "Mom, you're late," Sophia whispered, then looked past her with a slow, puzzled focus that made the air change. The stranger stepped back as if he had walked into a memory, his face tightening for a fraction of a second before he smoothed it away. Marisol felt her stomach drop, because Sophia's gaze wasn't fear. Sophia's gaze was recognition. Sophia lifted the glittery ornament toward him as if it were an offering, then said in a small voice that landed like a stone in still water, "Why did you say our last name, Mom?" Marisol turned so fast her coat brushed the wall, her mind scrambling to find a safe explanation, because she had not told him her last name, not once, not even by accident. The stranger's eyes met hers, and in them she saw regret, like he had slipped and revealed something he meant to keep buried. He opened his mouth, then closed it again, and the silence that followed felt deliberate, almost rehearsed. And in that heavy pause, Marisol understood one terrifying thing: this man hadn't found her by luck. Morning came without softness, the kind of grey daylight that made everything look exposed, and Marisol barely slept because every creak of the building sounded like a decision returning to judge her. The stranger sat at her small kitchen table as if he didn't belong to any room that small, hands wrapped around a second cup of coffee, eyes fixed on nothing in particular. Sophia stayed close to Marisol's hip, watching him the way children watch storms, curious, cautious, sensing truth before they have words for it. Marisol tried to keep her breathing steady, but the question Sophia had asked kept echoing, because it wasn't just strange, it was impossible. And then, from outside, came the low purr of an engine that didn't sound like anyone's ordinary life. A black SUV rolled to the curb with slow certainty, followed by another, their windows dark enough to hide intentions, and the whole street seemed to hold its breath. Two men stepped out first, thick coats, polished shoes, the kind of posture that suggests they don't ask for permission, they announce outcomes. A third followed, older, colder, scanning the building the way a landlord scans for damage, already calculating cost and consequence. Marisol's stomach tightened, and before she could move, the stranger rose with an urgency that turned his calm into something sharper. "Don't open the door," he said quietly, not pleading, but commanding in a way that didn't match his soaked clothes from the night before. Marisol felt the ground shift under her, because fear sounded different when it came from someone used to power. The knock wasn't frantic. It was measured, polite, and somehow more threatening because of it, like a hand that has never been denied. Marisol stepped into the hallway anyway, leaving the stranger behind her, and cracked the door enough to see the man in front, broad shoulders, earpiece, eyes that didn't blink much. "We're looking for someone," he said, voice smooth, the words rehearsed the way a lawyer rehearses mercy. Behind him, the older man looked past Marisol into the apartment as if her walls were glass, and his gaze lingered on Sophia just long enough to make Marisol's protective instinct flare. "Ma'am," the older man added, "this is not your concern, and it would be best if you cooperated quickly." Marisol heard the insult beneath the courtesy, the assumption that her kindness was either foolishness or a scheme. Marisol swallowed and forced herself to stand tall in a doorway that suddenly felt too small to hold her dignity, because she had spent her whole life being underestimated, and she refused to let it happen in front of her child. "I don't know who you're talking about," she said, choosing her words with care, while her mind raced through every possibility, every risk, every way this could explode. The younger man's smile didn't reach his eyes, and he shifted his stance slightly, blocking the walkway as if he were already inside. From behind Marisol, the stranger's footsteps approached, then stopped, controlled, as though he were resisting an impulse to reveal himself. Sophia's hand slipped into Marisol's, and the warmth of that small grip reminded her what was truly at stake. "We can call the police," Marisol offered, and the older man's expression hardened, as if she had suggested something vulgar. The stranger's voice came from behind her, low and steady, carrying a restrained authority that made the men outside listen even before they saw him. "Tell them you need time," he murmured, close enough that Marisol felt his breath, the desperation hidden beneath his calm like a heartbeat under thick cloth. Marisol glanced back, and in his eyes she saw not just fear, but urgency sharpened by knowledge, as if he knew exactly what these men could do when they believed they were cleaning up a problem. The older man's gaze flicked over Marisol's shoulder, and for the first time his composure faltered, replaced by recognition he tried to bury. Marisol understood then that this wasn't a rescue team coming to help a lost man. It was a machine coming to reclaim what it considered property. And in that breath of silence, with Sophia trembling beside her, Marisol realized the stranger wasn't asking her for shelter anymore. He was asking her to buy him minutes. Marisol kept the door cracked, her body angled so she could block the view into her apartment, while the men outside pretended not to notice how protective that posture was. The older one spoke again, softer now, as if lowering his voice could make his request feel like a favor instead of a demand, and he offered Marisol a name she didn't recognize, along with a title that sounded polished and corporate. He explained, carefully, that the man she had let in was in a delicate situation, and that it would be best for everyone if he returned with them immediately, no questions, no records, no disruptions to her life. The words were wrapped in courtesy, but the meaning underneath was blunt. They could make this easy, or they could make it ugly. Marisol felt heat rise in her throat, because she had helped a freezing stranger, not smuggled a criminal, and yet they were already speaking to her as if she'd done something wrong. When she insisted on calling an ambulance or a shelter or even the police, anything official, anything that made the truth harder to twist, the younger man's smile thinned and the older man's patience showed a hairline crack. "That won't be necessary," he said too quickly, and Marisol realized that whatever they feared wasn't the man's health, it was exposure. The stranger stayed behind her, silent, but his presence filled the hallway like a held breath, and Marisol could feel the tension in him as if it were a second heartbeat in the room. The older man slipped a card toward her through the gap in the door, glossy and heavy, the kind of card that belonged to people who never waited for a table. "You did a kind thing," headed, as though kindness were a service that required paperwork, "and we believe in rewarding cooperation." Marisol didn't take the card, because the idea of being rewarded for doing what was human made her stomach turn. The next thing he slid forward wasn't a card, but an envelope, and the way he held it suggested it wasn't money. It was leverage dressed up as gratitude. He spoke about inconvenience and compensation, and he used gentle words the way some people use perfume to hide rot. But Marisol heard what he was really saying. Accept this, stay quiet, and we'll pretend you're not in the way. In her peripheral vision, she saw Sophia peeking from behind the kitchen wall, eyes huge and unblinking, absorbing everything, learning in real time what power sounds like when it wants something. Marisol's chest tightened with a mother's anger, because there are lessons you can't unteach once a child has seen them. Behind her, the stranger finally spoke, his voice hoarse but firm, and when he told Marisol not to take the envelope, not to let this become a transaction, there was a tremor in his words that sounded like shame. Marisol's hands curled into fists at her sides, not because she wanted to fight, but because she needed something in her body to hold the line her heart was drawing. "I didn't do it for money," she said, and the sentence came out calmer than she felt, a kind of prayer for self-respect. The older man's eyes flicked over her face, as if measuring how much pressure it would take to break her. And then he let out a small sigh, like a man disappointed by a stubborn object. "Then you understand," he replied, "that refusing help creates complications." And the word complications landed like a threat, wearing a tie. Marisol felt the floor tilt because she knew complications in her world meant missed shifts, late bills, a landlord who didn't care about explanations, and a child who deserved stability. Kindness, she realized, was easy to applaud in a story, but in real life it often came with a price tag someone else insisted you pay. The stranger's eyes met hers, and for a moment the mask he'd worn all night slipped, revealing raw fear, mixed with something like gratitude that hurt to look at. "Please," he murmured, barely loud enough for anyone else to hear, and the plea wasn't for comfort anymore, it was for dignity, for one last chance to choose his own next step. Marisol looked at the envelope, then at Sophia, then at the men outside, and she understood the cruelty of it. They wanted to turn her compassion into evidence that she could be bought. She drew a slow breath and pushed the door a little wider, not in surrender but in defiance, because she refused to be cornered into shame. The older man's expression sharpened, as if he had just decided she was no longer a person, but an obstacle, and Marisol felt a cold certainty settle into her bones. Whatever this was, it was only beginning. Marisol closed the door with a slow, deliberate motion, not to shut the world out, but to keep it from barging in and rearranging her life without permission. In the small kitchen, the stranger stood very still, as if movement might trigger something waiting outside. Their eyes met, and in that look, Marisol felt two kinds of pride collide. Hers, built from surviving without begging, and his, built from never letting anyone see him fall. Sophia watched from the hallway, quiet as a prayer, and Marisol hated that her child was learning how fear can wear a polite face. She breathed in, counted to 3, and decided that panic would not lead her household. "You need to tell me the truth," she said, not harshly, but with the steady firmness of someone who has paid too many bills to tolerate games. The stranger's jaw tightened, and for a moment he looked like he might refuse on pure instinct, the way powerful people refuse out of habit. He glanced toward the window, where the dark SUVs waited like patient predators, and Marisol understood that his silence was not only pride, it was protection, misguided maybe, but real. "If I explain, you become a target," he murmured, and there was a bitterness in his voice, as if he'd seen that exact outcome too many times. Marisol answered with the truth that had shaped her entire life. "I'm already a target the moment they decided I was." She didn't raise her voice, yet every word carried a boundary, because kindness without boundaries becomes a leash someone else holds. The stranger swallowed, then offered a small piece of truth, the way a wounded animal offers its paw, hesitant, trembling, ready to pull back. He admitted he hadn't been robbed in the simple way he'd implied, and that he hadn't wandered here by accident, but had run deliberately from people who claimed they were keeping him safe. Marisol felt anger rise, not at him alone, but at the whole idea that safety could mean captivity when money was involved. Still, she kept her posture calm, because she knew that dignity is not just a feeling, it is a practice. Outside, footsteps moved on the sidewalk, and Marisol saw a neighbor's curtain twitch, then fall back into place as if curiosity had become suspicion. The stranger's gaze sharpened at the sound of a car door closing, and he stepped away from Sophia with a reflex that looked like shame, as though he feared his presence could stain a child's life. Marisol wanted to tell him that children are not stained by compassion, only by the absence of it, but she also couldn't ignore what was happening beyond her walls. She realized the men outside were not simply searching. They were enclosing, tightening the circle until the only options left would be surrender or disaster. And the worst part was how ordinary the pressure felt, because power rarely arrives with shouting. It arrives with control. Marisol walked to the sink and turned on the water, letting the sound create a small curtain of normalcy, the way she had done during hard moments since childhood. "You can stay," she said at last, "but not as a mystery that puts my daughter at risk." And she meant it, because love has rules when survival is on the line. The stranger nodded slowly, and in that nod, she saw a man wrestling with the one thing money cannot buy: the humility to be honest when honesty is terrifying. He leaned forward, voice low, and gave her a name that sounded real this time, though he still held back the whole truth, like a fire he feared would burn her. Marisol listened, and as the rain finally began to ease outside, she realized the storm had only moved indoors, waiting for the moment it could speak its full name. The pressure didn't arrive all at once. It gathered like ice on a window, thin at first, then suddenly impossible to ignore. Within an hour, Marisol heard the familiar sounds of the building waking up, doors opening, footsteps pausing, whispers traveling faster than truth. And she knew the neighborhood had already decided to watch her like she was a warning. Outside, the SUVs stayed parked with the patience of men who never miss what they came for, and the stranger's silence grew heavier, as if he could feel the walls narrowing. Marisol tried to keep breakfast normal for Sophia, tried to speak in a gentle voice about cereal and cartoons, but even the simplest things felt fragile, like they could shatter with one careless breath. A hard knock came again, followed by a second voice. Official, clipped, practiced, until the word police floated through the door like smoke. When Marisol opened it, 2 officers stood beside the security men, as if the line between protection and intimidation had been erased with a signature she hadn't seen. The older corporate man spoke first, offering a story that sounded clean and urgent, and the officers listened with the tired impatience of people who believe trouble always comes from the same kinds of homes. Marisol tried to explain that she had sheltered a freezing man for one night, that no crime had occurred beyond human cruelty, but her words landed against a wall of assumptions. In the hallway, neighbors leaned out just enough to see, and their eyes didn't ask what happened. They asked what she had done. Then the first real wound struck where she could least afford it. Her phone buzzed, and her manager's name flashed across the screen like an ending. Marisol answered, hoping for a lifeline, but his voice was already cold with self-preservation, telling her not to come in anymore, telling her the diner couldn't be associated with whatever scandal was brewing. She heard the unspoken truth beneath his excuse, that a waitress is replaceable, and dignity is not a policy the company carries. Sophia clutched Marisol's sweater, sensing the shift in the air, and the stranger's face tightened, as if he were watching his own choices destroy someone else's life in real time. Marisol felt her chest constrict, not from fear of being fired, but from the deeper insult of being discarded for doing what was right. The security chief stepped forward with a clipboard, the kind of calm authority that makes lies look professional, and he offered Marisol an easy path that was anything but. "Sign this," he said softly, as though he were doing her a kindness, "just a statement that you acted alone, that you invited him in knowing who he was, and that no one pressured you." Marisol stared at the paper and saw the trap inside the neat sentences. If she signed, she became a schemer. If she refused, she became a threat. She looked at the stranger, expecting him to speak, to stop this, to finally break the silence with a truth strong enough to protect her. But he only shook his head once, small and desperate, like a man who knows the cost of truth in a world that sells it. Marisol felt something in her straighten, a quiet spine forming from years of surviving, and she said no, not loudly, not dramatically, but with the kind of certainty that cannot be bought. The officers exchanged a glance that said the decision had already been made, and one of them reached for her wrist with a gentleness that didn't soften the humiliation. Metal clicked around her skin, cold and final, while Sophia's face crumpled in a way Marisol would carry for the rest of her life. "Mom, no, Mom!" Sophia cried, and the sound tore through the apartment like a siren, turning Christmas lights into something cruel and mocking. Marisol tried to kneel, tried to reassure her child with a look, but the handcuffs held her upright, forcing her to be marched toward the door as if kindness were evidence. And as the stranger stood there, pale and silent, watching her take the fall meant for him, Marisol realized the true loss wasn't her job or her reputation. It was the moment her daughter learned how easily the world punishes a good heart. The ride to the station felt unreal, like Marisol had stepped out of her own life and into someone else's punishment, and the city lights passing the window looked too bright for what she was feeling. Her wrists ached where the cuffs pressed, but the deeper pain was the image of Sophia in the doorway, reaching for her as if love alone could stop the world. An officer spoke in a neutral tone about procedure, yet every word sounded like a door closing, and Marisol stared at her hands to keep from breaking apart. She tried to pray, but the prayers came out tangled, caught between anger and fear, and she wondered if heaven ever listened to women who worked late and did the right thing anyway. When the car stopped, the air outside hit her face like a reminder that kindness had become evidence, and she had no idea how to turn it back. In a small holding room that smelled of old paper and tired coffee, Marisol sat beneath fluorescent lights that made everyone look guilty, even the innocent. The officers asked questions that circled her like vultures, and she answered with the truth as plainly as she could, because the truth was the only thing she still owned. She explained the rain, the trembling man, the coffee, the blanket, and the way the men in black coats had spoken to her, as if her compassion were a crime. One officer listened without expression, another with impatience, and Marisol felt the familiar weight of being judged by her accent, her job, and the size of her life. Still, she kept her voice steady, because she refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing her dignity fall. Time moved strangely, and in the quiet gaps between questions, Marisol's mind kept running back to Sophia, imagining her curled up with the neighbor, wondering if her mother had been taken away for doing something wrong. Marisol's throat tightened every time she pictured her daughter's face, because she knew children remember fear the way they remember songs, repeating it long after the moment has passed. She reached into her pocket and found the small rosary she carried, the beads warm from her hand, and she held it like a fragile rope tying her to who she was. She didn't ask God for miracles. She asked for strength, for clarity, for a way to keep Sophia safe when the world felt eager to crush softness. In the hum of the lights, she admitted a truth she hated. She was afraid that being good had made her weak in the eyes of people who only respected power. Hours later, when they finally allowed her a phone call, the line rang and rang before a trembling voice answered, and Marisol heard the neighbor's worry before she heard words. Sophia had cried herself into sleep, the neighbor said, and Marisol closed her eyes as relief and guilt collided because her child was safe but not whole. Marisol asked if the stranger had been seen, if anyone had come back, if the men in suits had returned, and the neighbor hesitated before confessing that a black SUV had come and gone like a shadow. The stranger, it seemed, had vanished from the story the moment Marisol became its scapegoat, and that thought burned more than the cold metal on her wrists. When the call ended, Marisol sat in the silence and felt a bitter question rise in her. What is the worth of compassion if it leaves your child scared and your name dragged through the dirt? Near midnight, the station grew quieter, and Marisol was released with warnings spoken in soft voices that felt sharper than shouting because they carried the promise of consequences. She stepped outside into air that smelled like wet asphalt and distant pine, and the Christmas decorations on nearby buildings looked almost obscene in their cheerfulness. She walked home slowly, shoulders tight, imagining neighbors peeking through curtains, imagining whispers being traded like currency, imagining Sophia waking up and not trusting the world the same way again. At her apartment door, she paused with her key in hand, suddenly unsure what kind of home she was walking back into, because safety can disappear without moving an inch. And as she finally pushed the door open, a single thought settled deep in her chest, heavy and unresolved. If the stranger truly mattered enough to bring all that power to her doorstep, then why had he left her to face it alone? The apartment was quieter than she remembered, the kind of silence that presses against you, making everything feel too still. Marisol stepped inside, the weight of the door closing behind her like a chapter ending, though she couldn't tell if it was an ending that had begun or just one that had been delayed. Sophia lay curled up on the couch, clutching the small ornament she'd made, her face streaked with tears. Marisol's heart twisted painfully in her chest as she knelt beside her daughter, brushing the hair from Sophia's forehead. "Mom," Sophia whispered sleepily, her voice full of both relief and lingering fear. "I knew you'd come back." Marisol smiled, though it was shaky and uncertain, and pulled Sophia into a tight hug. In that moment she realized that everything she had fought for wasn't just her own survival. It was to keep Sophia from seeing the world as a place where people who care get punished. The thought of what had happened still burned in her mind. She couldn't understand why the stranger had disappeared, why he hadn't stayed to face the consequences of his own actions, why he had left her holding the pieces of his mess. But there was one thing Marisol knew for certain. She couldn't stay tangled in that confusion. Sophia needed her to be present, to make the world feel safe again, and that meant she had to let go of the rage that kept rising in her chest. She'd learned over the years that safety wasn't just a feeling. It was a choice you made over and over again, even when the world didn't want you to. The phone rang, and for a moment Marisol thought about letting it go to voicemail, but something inside her told her that if this was the call she had been waiting for, she couldn't miss it. She reached for the receiver, heart pounding as she pressed it to her ear. "Marisol?" a voice said, calm but urgent. It was the lawyer from the church, a person she had never met but who seemed to know exactly who she was. "We've been following your case. I think you deserve more than what's happening right now." Marisol's heart gave a painful lurch, but she managed to ask, "What do you mean?" The voice on the other end explained quickly that there had been some movement behind the scenes. A legal team was prepared to fight on her behalf, but they needed one thing: her cooperation. It wasn't much, just a chance to make things right, to make the truth visible, but it was a start. Marisol hesitated. The shadow of the men from earlier still loomed over her, the thought that someone might be watching her again, waiting to strike. But as she glanced at Sophia's sleeping form, a quiet resolve settled in her. She couldn't back down. Not now. She couldn't let fear win. "I'll do whatever I need to," she said, her voice steady for the first time in days. The lawyer gave her a small, quiet thanks before hanging up, and for a moment Marisol let the silence wash over her. It wasn't a perfect victory, and it wasn't the resolution she had dreamed of when she first opened that door to help a stranger. But it was something, and that something felt like a spark in the dark. She looked down at Sophia, still curled into sleep, her face soft in a way that reminded Marisol that there was still kindness in the world, even when it seemed too easy to forget. The thought of her daughter kept her going, kept her from sinking into the despair that whispered just beneath the surface. In the days that followed, Marisol learned that the road to redemption was rarely straight. She would have to fight, to expose the lies that had been spun around her, to show that she hadn't made a mistake, that kindness didn't deserve punishment. But there was something she hadn't anticipated, something small but powerful. In the midst of the pressure, the scrutiny, the pain, there were people who believed in her, the neighbor who offered to watch Sophia, the lawyer who stood by her without asking for anything in return, and the stranger who, even if he had disappeared into the shadows, had ignited a fire she hadn't known she still had. And as Marisol stood at the window, looking out over the city, she knew that this fight wasn't just for her. It was for every person who had been discarded, for every soul whose kindness had been twisted into a weakness. It was for Sophia, who would learn the value of compassion and the strength it took to hold on to it. It was for herself, because for the first time in a long time, Marisol knew she was not alone, not anymore. Marisol stepped back into her apartment as if returning from a storm no one else could see, and the first thing she heard was Sophia's uneven breathing on the couch. Mrs. Delaney, the elderly neighbor from downstairs, rose slowly from the armchair and touched Marisol's sleeve with a gentleness that carried years of quiet endurance. Sophia stirred, blinked up at her mother, and then clung to her as though the world might take her away again if she let go. Marisol held her daughter tightly, breathing in the smell of soap and warm blankets, and whispered that they were safe for tonight, even if safety felt borrowed. In that embrace, she made a promise that steadied her hands. She would not let lies become the story Sophia grew up believing. By morning, the church basement became their first refuge, not because it was grand, but because it was honest, filled with folding chairs and the scent of coffee made by people who didn't ask for credentials before offering warmth. A pastor with tired eyes listened without interrupting, and Mrs. Delaney spoke up in a voice that surprised even herself, telling them she had seen the SUVs and the men who moved like they owned the sidewalk. Someone mentioned a lawyer, Mr. Halpern, who had once been helped by Marisol's father when kindness was the only currency that mattered, and the name landed like a small door opening. When Marisol called, she expected skepticism, but instead she heard a measured calm, the voice of someone who knew power often hides behind paperwork. He told her they would fight with facts, not feelings, and Marisol realized hope did not arrive with fireworks, it arrived with steps. They started where truth often survives: cameras, timestamps, ordinary details the mighty forget because they assume nobody will check. The diner had security footage, and there was a streetlight camera near Marisol's building that might show the SUVs arriving and leaving, proof that this wasn't a simple Good Samaritan gone wrong, but a coordinated pressure campaign. Mr. Halpern asked her to write everything down, minute by minute, from the first knock to the handcuffs, because memory becomes slippery when fear keeps shaking it. Marisol sat at her kitchen table and wrote until her wrist ached, describing the stranger's trembling hands, the envelope offered like bait, Sophia's scream, the smell of wet wool and cold rain. As she wrote, her shame began to thin, replaced by something firmer, the certainty that dignity deserved a record. But the world pushed back immediately, as if it could sense the truth taking shape and wanted to crush it before it learned to walk. Marisol went to the diner to ask for the footage, and her manager's face tightened with panic, insisting the system had glitched and that he didn't want trouble, as if trouble were a weather pattern he could avoid by closing his blinds. Mr. Halpin's letter arrived that afternoon, formal and sharp, and suddenly the manager's excuses changed shape, turning into reluctant cooperation. Still, Marisol could feel eyes on her as she crossed parking lots and sidewalks, and she learned the exhausting lesson that intimidation doesn't need to touch you to leave bruises. Each time fear rose, she looked at Sophia's small face and reminded herself that courage was not a mood. It was a decision repeated until it became a habit. That night, as Marisol washed dishes in the dim kitchen light, her phone rang from an unknown number, and her heart tightened before she even answered. The voice on the other end was low and careful, not warm, not cruel, simply urgent in the way a warning is urgent when it arrives too late to ignore. "They're trying to erase what happened," the caller said, and Marisol's fingers went cold around the phone as the water kept running, meaningless and loud. She demanded to know who it was, but the voice only hesitated, as if choosing between protection and truth, then added, "He didn't forget you. They're the ones hiding him." And when the line went dead, Marisol stood very still, realizing that the fight had just gained a new, dangerous heartbeat. The next morning, Marisol carried Sophia to school with a smile that felt borrowed, then walked home as if every step might crack the thin ice beneath her life. The anonymous warning kept repeating in her mind because it sounded less like gossip and more like someone trying to keep her alive. She told herself to focus on practical things, work she no longer had, bills that did not pause for injustice, a child who deserved steadiness, but her hand still trembled when she poured coffee. The world outside looked normal, cars passing, Christmas wreaths hanging, neighbors pretending not to stare, and that normality was the cruelest part. It made her feel as if the truth were a small, fragile thing she had to protect with her whole body. "Mr. Halpin called near noon and spoke quietly, as though even the phone line could be listening, and he told her there had been a medical admission at the county hospital under a name that did not match any real record. It was the kind of detail that would mean nothing to most people, but to a lawyer it meant someone was moving a person without leaving fingerprints. Marisol's first instinct was fear, yet beneath it rose something else, an insistence that she would not be used and then discarded, not again. She drove to the hospital with her heart banging against her ribs, repeating to herself that courage wasn't the absence of fear. It was the decision to keep going while fear shouted. At the front desk, she asked questions carefully, and the receptionist's eyes flicked toward the hallway as if she wanted to help, but didn't know how. A nurse found Marisol near the vending machines, a woman with tired hands and the cautious look of someone who had seen power twist rules in quiet rooms. She didn't give her a name, only a folded slip of paper pressed into Marisol's palm, as if it were contraband, and she whispered that a patient had asked for the waitress, the one who had opened a door on Christmas Eve. Marisol unfolded the note in the bathroom stall, blinking at the uneven handwriting, the words brief but heavy, promising that he hadn't meant for her to suffer and that he was trying to make it right. Before she could reread it, footsteps stopped outside the door and Marisol's breath caught because the building suddenly felt like a net. When she stepped out, she saw two men in dark coats at the end of the corridor, and she understood that the hospital was not a sanctuary. It was another controlled space. Back home, still shaken, she found the ring by accident, while folding the blanket he had worn, a weighty circle of metal that caught the light like a confession. It wasn't flashy in a cheap way. It was the kind of quiet wealth that never needs to announce itself, engraved on the inside with initials so clean they looked carved by certainty. Marisol sat at her kitchen table and stared at it until the room felt too small, because now she wasn't just guessing. She was holding proof that the stranger's life belonged to a world that could rewrite stories with money. She considered turning it in, hiding it, throwing it away, but each option felt like letting them decide what her kindness meant. So she placed the ring in an empty jar and set it high on the shelf, telling herself that truth should be kept safe, not surrendered in panic. By evening, the town had chosen its sides, and Marisol could feel it in the way people looked at her, some with softened eyes, others with sharp suspicion, as if compassion were a trick she had played. A woman from the church brought food and squeezed her hand, while another neighbor muttered that Marisol was making trouble and should have stayed in her place. Marisol listened without arguing, because she was learning that people who fear the powerful often attack the vulnerable to feel less afraid. Yet even with allies beside her, she sensed a tightening in the air, the approach of a bigger move, something planned and clean and ruthless. And as she turned off the lights and pulled Sophia close for the night, Marisol realized the most frightening possibility was not that the truth would come out, but that it would come out in a way that crushed her before it could save her. Marisol did not learn the truth in a dramatic confession, but in the quiet cruelty of a television playing in the corner of a diner, the volume low, the faces bright, the headlines sharp. She had gone there with Mr. Halpin to sign a request for the missing footage, hoping the paper trail would pin the story down before it was rewritten again, and she tried to keep her shoulders steady while the manager avoided her eyes. Then the screen changed, and a familiar face appeared beneath a holiday banner, framed by perfect lighting that made him look untouchable. The anchor's voice spoke of a philanthropist, an industry titan, a man missing after a sudden holiday disappearance, and Marisol felt her breath stall because the stranger's eyes were the same eyes that had blinked at her coffee steam. His name rolled across the bottom of the screen like a verdict: Ethan Caldwell. The diner's warm Christmas lights suddenly felt like a lie, and every memory of that night rearranged itself in her mind with a new, terrible clarity. The torn sweater, the controlled posture, the way he guarded his name as if it could be used to hunt him, all of it now made sense in a way that turned Marisol's stomach. She imagined those black SUVs again, not as helpers, but as an extension of his empire, people trained to manage him the way a company manages risk, quietly and without mercy. Mr. Halpin watched her expression change, and he guided her gently toward a booth, speaking in the patient tone of someone who knew that truth can feel like grief at first. Marisol looked down at her hands and realized her kindness had not sheltered an ordinary man from cold weather, but a powerful man from a colder kind of captivity. What shattered her calm was not only the billionaire's name, but the next detail the lawyer uncovered as he dug through local records with the steady hunger of someone who hates injustice. Caldwell Industries, it turned out, had fingerprints all over her town. Projects announced with speeches, promises made with smiles, and then closures that left families hollowed out. Marisol remembered her father coming home years ago with a quiet heaviness in his eyes, the way he had started working double shifts after a factory restructuring, the way pride kept him from complaining out loud. In Mr. Halpin's stack of papers, she saw dates, signatures, a corporate trail that led back to the season her father got sick from exhaustion and never fully recovered, and the room seemed to tilt. The story was no longer only about a man she had sheltered. It was also about the system that had squeezed her family long before she ever touched a diner door. Marisol left the diner with her heart pounding and drove straight to Mr. Halpin's office, because she could not carry those connections alone in her chest without breaking. The office smelled like paper and old coffee, and the walls were lined with framed certificates that looked fragile compared to the power she was up against. Mr. Halpin spoke in careful phrases about strategy and evidence, reminding her that anger without proof can be turned into a weapon against the person who feels it. Then he opened a file that had arrived through a private courier, sealed in a way that suggested it had been guarded more than it had been delivered, and he told her it was unusual, something Ethan had filed weeks earlier, before the rain, before the knock, before her life cracked open. The document was not a will exactly, not a contract, not anything that fit neatly into the lawyer's categories, but it carried the weight of intention, as if Ethan had planned for the possibility of being found at his lowest. When Mr. Halpin finally broke the seal, Marisol felt the air change, as if the room itself leaned closer to listen. Inside were instructions written in calm, deliberate language, directed to a trustee and stamped with legal authority, and the first line made Marisol's skin go cold. It referred to the person who shelters me when I come without name or protection. And then, beneath that, in ink that looked unmistakably final, was a name typed with absolute precision. Marisol Vega. She stared at it, unable to blink, because she knew she had never told Ethan her full name, and yet it sat there on the page like he had been carrying her life in his pocket long before Christmas Eve. The next day did not feel like Christmas season anymore. It felt like a courtroom built out of sidewalks, phone screens, and hungry opinions. Marisol walked into Mr. Halpin's office with Sophia's small hand in hers, and she could sense the town watching, as if her life had become a lesson they were eager to misread. A local reporter waited by the steps, microphone lifted with a smile that pretended to be gentle, and Marisol realized even compassion could be turned into a headline. She kept her chin steady because she refused to let fear teach her daughter to shrink. Somewhere beneath the noise, a quiet truth held on. She had opened a door for a freezing man, and that was not a sin. Inside the conference room, the air was too clean, too controlled, and the people in suits spoke in the language of liability rather than humanity. The security chief sat with his hands folded like a pastor, while a corporate executive from Caldwell's circle arranged papers as if arranging reality itself. They said Marisol had inserted herself into a private matter, that she had interfered, that she might have been seeking leverage, and each phrase was polished enough to sound reasonable to anyone who didn't know what cold looks like on a person's skin. When Marisol tried to explain the rain, the shaking, the hunger, they smiled politely, as if her words were sentimental decorations on a serious table. She felt the old insult rising again, the one that says people like her are always suspicious when they speak of dignity. Mr. Halpin placed a calm hand over her notes, a reminder that truth could be quiet and still cut through steel. They offered her a settlement without using the word, a neat package of money and silence, wrapped in the promise that her record would be handled. Marisol's throat tightened, because they were trying to buy the meaning of her kindness, to rewrite it as a transaction so they could own it. Sophia shifted beside her, sensing the tension the way children sense thunder, and Marisol's protective love hardened into something firmer than fear. She told them she didn't want money for doing what was right, and she didn't want mercy from people who had shown none. The executive leaned back as if amused, as if her refusal were a childish mistake he could afford to let her make. Then the security chief's eyes narrowed, and Marisol understood the room was no longer negotiating. It was deciding how to crush her cleanly. That was when Mr. Halpin began placing facts on the table like stones, each one heavy enough to keep the story from floating away. He produced the time-stamped call logs, the witness statement from Mrs. Delaney about the SUVs and the first partial recovery from the diner's security system, salvaged before it could be lost again. The footage did not show a con artist chasing fame. It showed a waitress handing a blanket to a man who could barely stand, and it showed men in expensive coats arriving with the calm certainty of people used to taking what they want. Marisol watched the executive's smile falter by a fraction, watched the security chief's jaw tighten as if he were swallowing anger. In that moment she felt something shift in the room, not into justice yet, but into caution, and caution was the first crack in their confidence. Even so, she could tell they were already reaching for a new story, because powerful people do not surrender. They simply change tactics. The executive's smile returned, thinner now, and he tapped the table lightly as if he were calling the meeting back to order. He spoke Ethan's name with ownership, not respect, and said there were arrangements Marisol could not possibly understand, arrangements made long before a rainy night at a diner. Then he looked directly at her, as if aiming the next sentence at her dignity, and his voice softened into something almost friendly. "You don't know what Ethan promised us," he said, and the words landed like a locked door inside Marisol's chest, because she could feel the shape of a deeper betrayal forming behind them. The conference room door opened without drama, yet the air changed, as if the building itself had felt a name enter. Marisol looked up expecting another suit, another polished threat, and instead she saw a man moving slowly, guarded on both sides but not carried, walking on his own will, pale and bruised beneath the clean lighting. His eyes found hers, and the room's power shifted, not because of money, but because the missing piece of the truth had finally decided to stand in the open. Even the executive's confidence paused, like a clock catching on a broken gear. Ethan Caldwell was no longer a headline on a screen. He was a man breathing, present, and unmistakably shaken. He lifted one hand, not as a signal of authority, but as a quiet oath that he would not hide behind anyone's words. When he spoke, his voice was steady in the way people sound when they have rehearsed denial for years and finally choose honesty instead. He admitted he had left his world on purpose, not as a game, not as a stunt, but as a desperate attempt to feel what life was like without people managing him like an asset. He said he wanted to know if anyone would treat him like a human being when he looked like nothing, and the shame in his eyes made Marisol's throat tighten. The room listened because it had no choice. The truth had arrived, wearing the face they all served. Ethan turned toward Marisol, and the softness of his expression did not erase what she had suffered, but it made her suffering visible in a way the suits could not dismiss. He said her name carefully, as if he understood it belonged to her and not to the story others were trying to steal, and then he apologized, plainly, without performance. He admitted his people tried to contain the situation, not to protect her, but to protect the image of a man they preferred to keep untouchable. He told the officers had been called to create pressure, and that pressure had landed where it always lands, on the person with the smallest shield. Marisol felt her anger rise, yet it was tangled now with something else, because his apology sounded like regret, not strategy. The executive tried to interrupt, mentioning contracts, promises, and obligations made inside boardrooms where kindness never gets a seat at the table. Ethan looked at him the way a man looks at a cage after realizing he can no longer live inside it, and his voice sharpened without becoming cruel. He said any promise that required destroying an innocent woman was not a promise worth keeping, and he stated calmly that he would testify to everything, who came to Marisol's door, what they offered, what they threatened, and why. Mr. Halpin slid the document forward, the one with Marisol's name, and Ethan confirmed it with a nod that made the room go still. In that silence, Marisol understood. The system did not fear her compassion, it feared his refusal to keep playing along. When the meeting ended, Marisol stepped into the hallway with Sophia close, feeling as if she had walked through fire and come out still standing, yet not unscarred. Ethan approached her slowly, stopping at a respectful distance, as if he finally understood that dignity includes space. He said quietly that he owed her more than cleared charges and restored work, because he had dragged his storm into her home and watched it break her peace. Marisol wanted justice, wanted her life back, wanted her daughter to feel safe again, but as she looked at the man who had caused it, intentionally or not, she realized something frightened her more than losing. She realized winning might still leave her with the hardest question of all, whether her heart could forgive what her pride could never forget. The days that followed were strange, like the town had been rearranged in slow motion, its familiar streets becoming unfamiliar, its people transformed from neighbors to spectators. The public narrative spun rapidly, feeding off the story that Ethan Caldwell's disappearance had been a calculated test of human compassion. People whispered about the waitress who had stood up to the world's richest, about the woman who had opened her door to a man she didn't recognize, not knowing she was letting in more than she could handle. The town's split was inevitable. Some praised Marisol for her strength, others called her naive, even reckless. But there was one thing they all agreed on. She had refused to be swept up in a game she wasn't willing to play. Marisol and Sophia moved through the days with a kind of cautious peace that Marisol knew would be fragile. Sophia still asked questions, still wondered why strangers with expensive shoes had come to their door, still clung to her mother's side like a security blanket. Marisol didn't have the answers Sophia needed, but she did her best to fill the silence with as much love and warmth as she could. She cooked breakfast like it was an act of rebellion, served it with a smile, even when her mind circled back to the image of Ethan in that sterile conference room, standing at the edge of the power that had tried to crush her. She wasn't angry anymore, at least not in the way she had been, but something had changed between them, something irrevocable. It was a shift in her understanding of what it meant to help someone, and what it cost to give, even when you had nothing to gain. One night, after the dust had begun to settle, after the charges against her were dropped and the diner offered her a job back, she sat on the couch with Sophia, both of them tangled in the comfort of an evening they hadn't earned, but had somehow found. The phone rang, its tone breaking the quiet between them, and Marisol picked it up without thinking. It was Ethan. His voice on the other end wasn't formal, wasn't distant, it was human. He asked how she was doing. She could hear the hesitation in his voice, the quiet ache of someone who had not yet learned how to truly apologize, but who still wanted to make amends. "I'm trying to make things right," Ethan said quietly, and Marisol could hear the weight of the words. "I've arranged for a scholarship in your father's name, something that will support the workers you've seen suffer from the corporate decisions I've made. And I want to help you, Marisol, if you'll let me." Her first instinct was to refuse, to close the door in his face, just as she had that first night, but there was no door to close now, not between them, not in her heart. She had already forgiven the part of him that had acted out of fear, and she realized in that moment that forgiveness wasn't about erasing the past, it was about choosing what to carry forward. "I don't need your money," Marisol said, her voice steady, but there was something soft in it too. "But if you can help the people who need it most, not just me, people who still have no choice." Ethan's voice caught, and for a moment Marisol could hear the weight of everything he had never allowed himself to feel. The shame, the grief, the guilt that had haunted him for years in the gilded cage he had built for himself. "I will," he said simply. "I promise." She hung up after a moment of quiet. And as she looked over at Sophia, her daughter's small, trusting face, the only thing that still grounded her, Marisol felt a kind of peace settle in. This wasn't the resolution she had imagined when she had first opened the door that night. But it was a beginning of something new, something that didn't erase the past, but used it to carve out a better future. Ethan's world would not change overnight, but neither would hers. And that was the point. Sometimes the weight of doing the right thing doesn't show up in grand gestures or headlines. Sometimes it shows up in small, quiet acts that ripple through the lives of the people who choose to believe in each other, like a mother and a daughter, choosing each other every day, even when the world says there's no reason to. As Marisol sat back, feeling the warmth of the room wrap around her, she knew one thing for sure. No matter what came next, she had not just survived. She had learned to walk through the storm and find the sun waiting on the other side. Marisol leaned back against the couch, Sophia nestled beside her, and for the first time in months, she felt a soft peace wrap around her heart. "We'll be okay," she whispered to Sophia, the words soft but firm, a promise to both of them. "We'll always be okay, as long as we keep choosing the right thing." Snow came late that year, drifting down in slow, quiet flakes that made the town look gentler than it had been, as if the sky itself wanted to soften what people had hardened. Marisol walked to the diner before sunrise, the streets still asleep, her breath turning white in the cold, and for the first time in months she didn't feel like she was bracing for impact. Inside, the familiar smells, coffee, warm bread, a faint trace of cleaner, welcomed her back like a life that had waited patiently. The scandal had faded into new headlines, but the lesson stayed, stitched into her posture and her voice. She tied her apron the way someone ties on purpose, not submission, and the knot felt like a promise. Sophia's laughter returned in small pieces, first in the kitchen, while Marisol stirred soup, then in the living room as she danced with socks on the carpet, then finally in the doorway as she watched her mother leave for work without crying. On a quiet evening, they hung a new ornament on their little tree, a tiny wooden door painted gold with glitter around the edges, and Sophia said it meant, "People can come in when it's cold." Marisol kissed her forehead and added gently that it also meant you can decide what stays and what leaves, because a good heart is not a house without locks. The child nodded, absorbing it the way children absorb truth when it's offered with love instead of fear. And in that moment, Marisol realized that healing wasn't a sudden relief, it was the slow return of trust. Ethan kept his distance at first, not because he was indifferent, but because he was finally learning that making amends is not the same as making appearances. He funded a workers' relief program in the town and publicly acknowledged closures that had broken families, including the season Marisol's father had started working himself into sickness. And the apology did not erase the past, but it stopped pretending it didn't exist. He met with local leaders without cameras. He sat in rooms where people spoke to him without flattering. And he listened like Ammon, who had spent too long being surrounded by agreement. When Marisol saw his name on a new scholarship honoring her father, she cried quietly, not from gratitude for money, but from the rare feeling of being seen. The power that once crushed now had to kneel before truth, and that was a kind of justice she had never expected to witness. The diner became again an ordinary place, which was the greatest redemption of all, because ordinary is where dignity lives when no one is clapping. Marisol served coffee to truck drivers, to lonely widowers, to young couples counting coins, and sometimes she offered a warm meal when she recognized the same hollow look she had seen on Ethan's face that rainy night. She didn't tell her story to everyone, because she didn't need to, but she carried it in the way she spoke to people who felt invisible, as if each customer were someone's whole world. Her manager apologized without poetry, awkward and sincere, and Marisol accepted it without letting it define her, because forgiveness does not mean forgetting your worth. What changed was not that life became perfect, but that Marisol stopped doubting the value of her own compassion. One night, close to the next Christmas, Marisol locked the diner and stood for a moment under the glowing lights, listening to the quiet street and the soft hum of the sign, feeling peace settle like a warm blanket around her shoulders. She thought about how easy it would have been to keep the door closed that first night, how sensible it would have been, how safe, and how it would have left her heart smaller. Instead, she had chosen dignity, and though the world tried to punish her for it, the truth had returned and made room for something better. Some people spend their lives believing money can buy everything, and some people learn, often too late, that what saves a person is a simple act of human kindness offered when it's least convenient. If this story touched your heart, leave a heart in the comments and subscribe for more stories about kindness and redemption.